Close your eyes. Take a slow breath in and let it go. Tonight we are leaving the modern world behind. We are leaving the noise and the screens and the endless rushing of everything. We are going somewhere ancient. Somewhere the air smells of cypress trees and warm stone and the distant salt of the Mediterranean Sea. We are going to Rome. Not the Rome of tour groups and selfie sticks and crowded museums, the real Rome. The Rome of 7 hills above a muddy river. The Rome of a small village of shepherds that grew, slowly and almost impossibly, into the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Rome of senators in white togas, walking through marble forums. The Rome of legions marching on roads so well built that some of them are still there today, 2,000 years later, with grass growing up between the stones. Tonight, we are going to tell the entire story, from the very beginning, from the legend of 2 brothers raised by a wolf, all the way through more than 1,000 years of one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever known. This is a long story. It was a long civilization. And tonight we have all the time we need. So get comfortable. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you. Feel the weight of yourself, the heaviness of your arms, the warmth beneath you. And as you lie there in your own warm darkness tonight, the story of ancient Rome will wash over you slowly, like the Tiber River itself, quiet and steady and ancient, carrying you gently wherever it goes. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to stay awake for any of it. Just let the words come. Let the story come. Let the ancient world settle around you like dust settling after a long day on the road. And somewhere in this long, warm telling of one of history's greatest stories, you will fall asleep. Let us begin at the beginning, at the river, and the hills and the legend. Long before Rome was an empire, long before it was even a city, it was just 7 hills. Rising above a river in the middle of the Italian peninsula, the river was called the Tiber. Not a grand river, not as wide as the Nile or as long as great rivers elsewhere in the world, but wide enough. And in a particular spot, about 15 miles from where it met the sea, there was an island in the middle of the river. And near that island the water was shallow enough to cross on foot. This crossing point mattered enormously, because it meant that anyone travelling north or south along this part of Italy, anyone moving goods or animals or armies, would eventually need to pass through this exact place. And around that crossing point, on the hills rising above the marshy riverbank, people began to settle. We do not know their names. We do not know exactly when they first arrived, but archaeologists have found evidence of human settlement on these hills going back to at least the 10th century before Christ's small huts. Simple round structures with wooden poles and thatched roofs, the kind of dwelling that leaves almost no trace except for the holes where the support posts once stood. These early settlers were not building an empire. They were just trying to survive, farming the land, herding sheep and cattle on the hillsides, fishing in the river, trading with their neighbours, defending themselves when necessary. Ordinary people living ordinary lives on 7 hills above a river. But the Romans themselves, centuries later, told a different story about their origins, a story full of gods and wolves, and fratricide and destiny. The story goes like this. In the ancient city of Alba Longa, not far from where Rome would eventually stand, there lived a king named Numitor. His brother Amulius overthrew him and seized the throne. To prevent any challenge to his rule, Amulius forced Numitor's daughter, a young woman named Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to chastity, so that she could never have children who might one day claim the throne. But the god Mars, the god of war, came to her, and she bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius learned of this, he ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber River, but the servant given this terrible task could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he placed the babies in a basket and set them adrift on the flooded river. The basket came to rest at the base of one of the 7 hills, and there, According to the legend, a she-wolf found the crying infants, and instead of killing them, she nursed them, fed them, kept them alive. A woodpecker, sacred to Mars, brought them food as well. And eventually a shepherd named Faustulus found the boys and raised them as his own. Romulus and Remus grew up strong and proud, never knowing their true royal heritage until circumstances revealed it to them. They overthrew the usurper Amulius and restored their grandfather Numitor to his throne. And then, grateful for having survived, the twins decided to found a new city of their own, on the very hills where the wolf had found them. But the brothers disagreed about which hill should be the centre of the new city. Romulus favoured the Palatine Hill, Remus favoured the Aventine. And, in their disagreement, in a moment that the Romans themselves would always remember with a kind of uneasy shame, Romulus killed his own brother, and he founded the city alone, naming it after himself, Roma. The traditional date the Romans gave for this founding was the 21st of April, 753 years before Christ. Now, we know this story is a legend. There was no actual she-wolf, no actual god of war fathering twins, no actual fratricide on a specific hillside, but legends matter. They tell us what a people believe about themselves. And this legend tells us something profound about how the Romans understood their own city, even from its earliest mythical beginnings, a city born of violence. A city that placed survival and strength above brotherhood when the two came into conflict, a city marked from its very founding by both divine favour and human ruthlessness. These two threads, the sacred and the violent, the favoured and the brutal, would run through the entire history of Rome. For more than 1,000 years, let that settle in your mind for a moment as you rest here in the dark. A wolf, a river, two brothers, a choice, and from that choice, an empire that would eventually rule from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, the largest, most enduring power the ancient Western world ever knew, all beginning, according to legend, with an infant crying in a basket on a flooded river. Let us continue. After Romulus, according to Roman tradition, came 6 more kings. This early period of Roman history is called, naturally enough, the regal period, or the period of the Roman kingdom. It lasted from the legendary founding in 753 before Christ until approximately 509 before Christ. About 240 years. We should be honest here, as we move through this part of the story, that the historical reliability of these early kings is uncertain. The Romans themselves, writing centuries later, were working from oral traditions and legends rather than contemporary written records. But the broad outline they describe is at least plausible and consistent with what archaeology tells us about early Rome. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a wise and peaceful king, who, according to tradition, established many of Rome's religious institutions and laws. He was followed by Tullus Hostilius, a more warlike king who fought against the neighbouring city of Alba Longa, the very city the legendary founders had come from. Then came Ancus Marcius, who expanded Roman territory and founded the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. Then something interesting happens in the traditional list of kings. The next several rulers have Etruscan names and connections. The Etruscans were a sophisticated civilization that dominated much of central Italy north of Rome during this period. They had their own language, their own art, their own religious practices, and their own urban culture, considerably more advanced in some respects than early Rome. Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan, became king of Rome and is credited with major building projects, including early versions of the Roman Forum and the Circus Maximus, the great arena where chariot races would later be held. Servius Tullius followed him, credited with significant reforms to Roman society, including a new system for organizing citizens by wealth for purposes of military service and voting. And finally came Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the 7th and last king of Rome. According to tradition, he was a tyrant, cruel, arrogant, ruling through fear rather than consent. And it was the actions of his son that finally brought down the monarchy entirely. The story goes that Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed a terrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman, unable to bear the shame of what had happened to her. Lucretia took her own life, but first she made her husband and her father swear to avenge her. This act of violence against an innocent and virtuous woman became the spark that ignited a revolution. Led by a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, the Romans rose up, expelled the king and his family, and swore that Rome would never again be ruled by a single king. This happened, according to tradition, in 509 before Christ. And from this moment, Rome became a republic, a res publica, a public thing, belonging to the people, not to any single ruler. This transition from monarchy to republic is one of the most important moments in all of Roman history, because the political structures the Romans built to replace their kings, the structures of the republic, would define Roman civilization for the next 500 years and would influence political thought for thousands of years after that, all the way down to the founders of the United States, who looked back explicitly to Republican Rome as a model for their own new government. So let us rest here for a moment in this transition. The kings are gone. A new kind of government is being born. The 7 hills above the river are about to become something the world has never quite seen before. Breathe slowly. Let the river flow past in the darkness. Let the legend settle into history, and let us continue into the age of the Republic. The Roman Republic that emerged from the expulsion of the kings was built around a few core ideas, all designed, fundamentally, to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power ever again. Instead of one king, the Romans elected 2 consuls each year, 2 men who shared supreme executive authority, each able to veto the actions of the other. This dual leadership was a deliberate safeguard. If both consuls had to agree before significant action could be taken, no single person could seize total control the way the kings had. Below the consuls, an elaborate system of other elected officials managed various aspects of government. Praetors handled legal matters, quaestors managed finances, aediles oversaw public works and games. Censors conducted the census and oversaw public morals, and presiding over much of this, though without formal executive power itself, was the Senate. The Senate was in many ways the heart of Roman political life for most of the Republic's history. It was composed of several hundred men, drawn primarily from the wealthy landowning aristocracy, who had typically already served in one of the elected magistracies. The Senate did not pass laws in the way we might think of a modern legislature. Technically, its decisions were advisory, called senatus consulta, recommendations rather than binding law, but in practice the Senate's authority was immense. Its accumulated experience, its control over foreign policy and finances, and the sheer social weight of its members meant that its recommendations were almost always followed. Roman society itself was deeply structured by class. At the top were the patricians, the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the earliest days of Rome. Below them were the plebeians, the common people, who made up the vast majority of the population. For much of the early republic, the plebeians struggled against patrician dominance, fighting for political rights, for the ability to hold office, for protection against arbitrary treatment by patrician magistrates. This struggle, sometimes called the conflict of the orders, played out over roughly 2 centuries, from the early 5th century before Christ into the early 3rd century before Christ, and gradually, through a combination of negotiation, protest, and occasionally outright secession. When plebeians would withdraw en masse from the city to force concessions, the plebeians won significant rights. They gained their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, who had the power to veto actions of magistrates that harmed plebeian interests. They gained the right to intermarry with patricians. They gained access to the consulship itself, and eventually, the laws passed by plebeian assemblies became binding on the entire Roman people, patrician and plebeian alike. This long internal struggle for fairness and representation resolved gradually and largely without the kind of violent revolution that would mark later periods of Roman history, is one of the most remarkable achievements of the early Republic, a society that managed to expand political rights and reduce internal conflict through negotiation and compromise rather than civil war. It would not always remain so peaceful, but for several centuries it largely was, and during these same centuries, while Rome was working out its internal political structures, it was also, slowly and steadily, expanding its control over the rest of Italy. The early Roman Republic spent much of its energy on its immediate neighbours, the other peoples of central Italy, the Etruscans to the north, various Latin-speaking peoples in the surrounding region, with whom Rome had complicated relationships of alliance and rivalry, the Sabines, the Volsci, the Aequi, names that appear again and again in the early military history of Rome, as the city fought a long series of wars to secure its position in the region. One of the most significant early conflicts was with the Etruscan city of Veii, a powerful rival located not far from Rome. According to tradition, the Romans besieged Veii for 10 years, an echo, perhaps deliberately, of the legendary 10-year siege of Troy in Greek mythology. The siege finally succeeded around 396 before Christ, and the destruction of Veii removed one of Rome's most significant regional rivals. But Roman expansion was not without serious setbacks. Around 390 before Christ, a group of Gauls, Celtic peoples from north of the Alps, swept down into Italy and, in a battle at the Allia River, inflicted a devastating defeat on the Roman army. The Gauls then marched on Rome itself and sacked the city. According to Roman tradition, only a small garrison managed to hold out on the Capitoline Hill, saved at one critical moment when the sacred geese kept in the temple of Juno began honking loudly, alerting the defenders to a surprise night attack by the Gauls, who were attempting to scale the hill silently. The Gauls eventually withdrew, reportedly after being paid a substantial ransom in gold. This sack of Rome, traumatic as it was, did not destroy the city or the Republic. If anything, it seemed to spur the Romans toward greater organization and military discipline in the decades that followed. They rebuilt, they strengthened their walls, they reformed their military organization. And gradually, over the course of the 4th century before Christ, Rome expanded its control over more and more of central Italy. The wars against the Samnites, a powerful confederation of peoples in the mountainous regions of central and southern Italy, were particularly significant. These wars, fought in several distinct phases over decades, tested Roman military organization severely and led to important reforms. It was during this period that the Roman legion, the famous military unit that would carry Roman power across much of the known world, began to take the form that would make it so effective. Soldiers, organized into smaller, more flexible units called maniples, rather than the large, rigid phalanx formations used by many other ancient armies. This flexibility allowed Roman armies to adapt more easily to difficult terrain and to the unpredictable tactics of enemies like the Samnites, who fought in the hills and forests of central Italy rather than on open battlefields. By the early 3rd century before Christ, Rome had effectively gained control over most of the Italian peninsula south of the Po River Valley. This was achieved not simply through conquest, but through a sophisticated and pragmatic system of alliances. Some conquered peoples were granted full Roman citizenship, others received partial citizenship rights. Still others remained technically independent allies, bound to Rome through treaties that typically required them to provide military support in exchange for protection and a share in the benefits of Roman expansion. This system, sometimes called the Roman Confederation, was remarkably effective. It gave conquered and allied peoples genuine stakes in Roman success, which made them generally reliable partners rather than resentful subjects waiting for an opportunity to rebel. The final major challenge to Roman control of Italy came from the Greek cities of southern Italy, who called in a foreign king, Pyrrhus of Epirus, to help defend them against Roman expansion. Pyrrhus won several battles against the Romans in the 280s before Christ, but at such heavy cost to his own forces that the term Pyrrhic victory, a victory so costly it amounts to a defeat, comes down to us from this very conflict. Eventually, Pyrrhus withdrew from Italy, and Rome's control over the peninsula was secured by 270 before Christ. Rome stood as the dominant power throughout the Italian peninsula, a position it had achieved through nearly 2.5 centuries of warfare, diplomacy, and the patient, methodical extension of its political and military system. But Italy itself was about to become merely the foundation, the base, from which an even greater expansion would begin. Rest here for a moment. In this turning point, Rome controls Italy, but across the sea to the south lies a great rival power, a maritime empire built on trade and naval strength, Carthage. And the conflict between these two powers would shape the next century of Roman history, and would ultimately determine whether Rome would remain a regional power or become something far greater. The wars between Rome and Carthage, known to history as the Punic Wars, from the Latin word punicus, referring to the Phoenician origins of the Carthaginians, are among the most consequential conflicts in ancient history. Carthage, located on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, was a wealthy trading city. Originally founded by Phoenician colonists from the eastern Mediterranean, by the 3rd century before Christ, Carthage controlled extensive territories in North Africa, much of Spain, and significant portions of Sicily, and possessed one of the most powerful navies in the ancient world. The First Punic War broke out in 264 before Christ, sparked by competing interests in Sicily. This war was fought primarily at sea, a domain where Rome had little previous experience but learned with remarkable speed. According to tradition, the Romans built their first significant war fleet by literally copying the design of a captured Carthaginian ship, plank by plank, despite their inexperience and despite suffering devastating losses, including entire fleets destroyed by storms. The Romans persisted with extraordinary determination. The war dragged on for 23 years, until 241 before Christ, when Rome finally secured a decisive naval victory, and Carthage was forced to accept peace terms, surrendering its claims to Sicily and paying a substantial indemnity. This first war set a pattern that would define the entire conflict between these two powers, a war of extraordinary length, extraordinary cost, and extraordinary stubbornness on both sides. The Second Punic War, beginning in 218 before Christ, is perhaps the most famous of the three conflicts, largely because of one extraordinary individual. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, had fought in the First Punic War and reportedly raised his son with an intense, lifelong hatred of Rome, having him swear an oath of eternal enmity toward the Roman state. Whether or not this specific story is entirely accurate, Hannibal certainly grew into one of the most brilliant military commanders of the ancient world, and he was determined to bring the war to Rome itself, rather than fighting on Carthaginian or Sicilian territory, as the first war had largely been fought. In a campaign of extraordinary boldness, Hannibal led an army, including a contingent of war elephants, across the Alps into Italy in 218 before Christ. The crossing itself was a brutal ordeal, conducted in difficult conditions with significant losses to weather, terrain, and hostile mountain tribes. But Hannibal succeeded in bringing a substantial force directly into Roman territory, a strategic surprise, that the Romans had not adequately prepared for. What followed was a series of catastrophic defeats for Rome. At the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at the Battle of Cannae in 216 before Christ, Hannibal inflicted losses on Roman armies that were almost unimaginable in scale. At Cannae alone, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers are estimated to have died in a single day, among the worst single-day military losses in human history up to that point. In the aftermath of Cannae, it seemed entirely possible that Rome itself might fall. Many of Rome's Italian allies began to waver, considering whether to defect to Hannibal's side, and yet Rome did not surrender. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of Roman character that emerges from this period, an almost stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of catastrophic losses. The Senate refused to negotiate with Hannibal. New armies were raised, again and again, even as previous ones were destroyed. And gradually, Roman strategy shifted. Rather than meeting Hannibal in direct, decisive battles, where his tactical brilliance gave him a significant advantage, Roman commanders, particularly Quintus Fabius Maximus, adopted a strategy of avoidance and attrition, harassing Hannibal's supply lines, refusing major engagements, and slowly wearing down his forces over time. This patient, frustrating strategy gave us the word Fabian, still used today to describe a strategy of cautious delay rather than direct confrontation. Meanwhile, Rome opened additional fronts in the conflict. Roman forces fought Carthaginian armies in Spain, gradually pushing Carthaginian influence out of the Iberian Peninsula entirely, and eventually, a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later be known as Scipio Africanus for his achievements, took the war directly to North Africa itself, threatening Carthage in its own homeland. This forced Hannibal, who had remained undefeated in Italy for years, to return to Africa to defend his home city. And at the Battle of Zama in 202 before Christ, Scipio finally defeated Hannibal in direct battle, ending the Second Punic War with a decisive Roman victory. Carthage was forced to accept harsh peace terms, surrendering Spain, paying enormous reparations, and severely limiting its military capabilities. But Carthage was not destroyed. Not yet. That would come 50 years later, in the Third Punic War. By the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, some Romans, most famously the senator Cato the Elder, had become convinced that Carthage, even diminished, remained a permanent threat to Rome, and that it must be eliminated entirely. Cato reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same ominous phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 before Christ, Rome found a pretext for war, and the Third Punic War began. This conflict was not a contest between equals. It was, essentially, a siege of a single city, conducted with grim and methodical determination. Carthage was besieged for 3 years, its population reduced to desperate starvation, before the city finally fell in 146 before Christ. The destruction that followed was thorough and deliberate. The city was burned, its walls demolished, its surviving population sold into slavery, and according to some ancient sources, its very fields were ritually cursed so that nothing would grow there again. Though this last detail may be a later embellishment rather than historical fact, whatever the precise truth of the destruction's details, the outcome was unmistakable. Carthage, once Rome's great rival for control of the Western Mediterranean, ceased to exist, and Rome stood alone as the dominant power in the entire Western Mediterranean world. Let us rest here, in this moment of victory and destruction. The wars are over, Carthage is gone, and Rome, the city that began as huts on 7 hills, now controls an empire stretching across Italy, Spain, North Africa, and beyond. But with this victory came new challenges. How do you govern such a vast territory? How do you maintain the values and institutions of a small republic when you have become a sprawling empire? These questions would consume Rome for the next century, and would ultimately transform the Republic into something else entirely. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of this transformation settle gently around you. The river still flows, the hills still stand, but everything else is changing. The century that followed the destruction of Carthage, roughly from 146 before Christ to the rise of Augustus around 30 before Christ, is often called the Late Republic, and it was a period of extraordinary internal turmoil. Even as Rome's external power continued to grow, the fundamental problem was this: the political and social structures that had served a relatively small, agrarian city-state worked less and less well for a sprawling territorial empire. Wealth poured into Rome from conquered provinces, but it was distributed with extreme inequality. Wealthy senators and equestrians, a class of prosperous businessmen and financiers, accumulated vast estates, often worked by enormous numbers of enslaved labourers brought back from conquered territories. Meanwhile, the small farmers, who had traditionally formed the backbone of the Roman legions, and the backbone of Roman society generally, found themselves increasingly squeezed out, unable to compete with large slave-worked estates, often forced to sell their land and migrate to the city, swelling the ranks of a growing urban poor. This growing inequality and social tension found its first major political expression in the career of Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebs who, in 133 before Christ, proposed significant land reforms aimed at redistributing public land to landless citizens. His proposals were bitterly opposed by much of the senatorial aristocracy, who saw their own interests directly threatened. The conflict escalated dramatically, and Tiberius Gracchus was killed by a mob of senators and their supporters, in what was, remarkably, the first instance of political violence, resulting in the death of a Roman magistrate in the Republic's history up to that point. His younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up similar reform efforts a decade later, with similarly violent results, killed in political violence in 121 before Christ. The deaths of the Gracchus brothers marked a grim turning point. Political disagreements in Rome had crossed a line, from being resolved through legitimate political processes, however contentious, into being resolved at least sometimes through outright violence. This pattern would only intensify in the decades that followed. The military reforms of Gaius Marius, a successful general who held the consulship an unprecedented 7 times, further transformed Roman society. Marius opened military recruitment to landless citizens, men who had no property, and therefore, under the traditional system, had not been eligible for military service. This solved an immediate manpower problem for Rome's armies, but it also created a new and dangerous dynamic. These soldiers, lacking property of their own, became dependent on their commanding generals for land grants and rewards after their service, rather than on the Roman state itself. This created armies whose loyalty was increasingly personal, tied to individual generals rather than institutional, tied to the Republic as a whole. This dynamic exploded into open civil war in the conflict between Marius and his former subordinate, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla, after a falling out with Marius over command of a war against King Mithridates of Pontus, marched his army on Rome itself in 88 before Christ. An unprecedented act that violated centuries of Roman political tradition, forbidding armies from entering the city. A bitter civil war followed, with control of Rome swinging violently between the two factions over several years. Sulla eventually emerged victorious, and in 82 before Christ, he had himself appointed dictator, an emergency office that traditionally carried a strict 6-month term limit, but which Sulla held with effectively unlimited duration and authority. Sulla used his power to conduct brutal proscriptions, posting public lists of his political enemies who could be legally killed, with their property confiscated by anyone willing to do the killing. Hundreds, Possibly thousands of Romans died in this purge. And yet, remarkably, after several years of this near-absolute power, Sulla voluntarily resigned his dictatorship and retired from public life in 79 before Christ, an act that surprised many of his contemporaries, and that historians still debate the motivations behind. But the precedent had been set. Sulla had shown that it was possible to march an army on Rome, seize total power, and survive the experience. This was a dangerous lesson, one that other ambitious men would remember. The generation that followed Sulla included some of the most famous names in all of Roman history. Cnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to us as Pompey the Great, achieved extraordinary military successes, clearing the Mediterranean of pirates, defeating King Mithridates decisively, and reorganizing the eastern provinces of the Roman world. Marcus Tullius Cicero, perhaps the greatest orator in Roman history, navigated the dangerous political currents of this era through eloquence and political maneuvering, achieving the consulship in 63 before Christ, and famously suppressing the conspiracy of Catiline, who had plotted to overthrow the Roman government. And Gaius Julius Caesar, born into an ancient but not especially wealthy patrician family, began a political and military career that would ultimately transform Rome forever. Let us rest here for just a moment. Before we continue into the story of Caesar, the Republic is fraying. The old structures, built for a small city-state, are straining under the weight of empire. Ambitious men are testing the limits of what the system will allow, and one man, in particular, is about to push those limits further than anyone before him. Breathe slowly, feel the tension of this moment, this turning point in history, and let it pass gently through you, like wind through cypress trees on a Roman hillside. The story continues. Julius Caesar's early career followed a fairly conventional path for an ambitious Roman aristocrat, holding a series of increasingly important offices, building political alliances, and accumulating both political debts and political favors. His decisive break into the front rank of Roman politics came through an alliance, often called the First Triumvirate, though this was an informal arrangement rather than any official institution, with Pompey the Great and a wealthy financier named Marcus Licinius Crassus. Together, these three men dominated Roman politics for several years in the late 50s before Christ, each using the other's support to advance their own ambitions. As part of this arrangement, Caesar secured for himself an extended military command in Gaul, the region covering roughly modern France and Belgium, along with parts of Switzerland and Germany. What followed, between 58 and 50 before Christ, was one of the most consequential military campaigns in ancient history. Caesar conquered the various Gallic tribes through a combination of military force, diplomatic maneuvering, and exploitation of divisions among the Gauls themselves. His own account of these campaigns, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, or Commentaries on the Gallic War, remains one of the most important surviving texts from the ancient world, both as a historical source and as a masterwork of clear, propagandistic Latin prose, written deliberately to keep Caesar's name and achievements prominent in the minds of the Roman public back home. The Gallic Wars were brutal. Caesar himself records, with a kind of cold matter-of-factness, instances of mass killing and enslavement of defeated populations that modern readers often find deeply disturbing, even accounting for the different moral standards of the ancient world. But militarily and politically, the campaigns were a triumph, extending Roman control over vast new territories and bringing Caesar enormous wealth, military glory, and the personal loyalty of a battle-hardened, experienced army. This last point would prove crucial. While Caesar was achieving these triumphs in Gaul, the political situation in Rome itself was deteriorating. Crassus died in a disastrous military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east in 53 before Christ, and the relationship between Caesar and Pompey, the two remaining power brokers, grew increasingly strained as each grew wary of the other's growing power and ambition. By 49 before Christ, the Senate, increasingly aligned with Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, stripped of his military command. Caesar, understanding that returning without his army would leave him politically vulnerable, perhaps fatally so, to prosecution by his political enemies, made one of the most fateful decisions in Roman history. He led his army across the Rubicon River, the boundary marking the edge of Italy proper, an act that, under Roman law, constituted an unambiguous declaration of civil war, since bringing an army into Italy itself was strictly forbidden. According to tradition, Caesar uttered the phrase "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. As he made this irreversible decision, the civil war that followed was fought across much of the Roman world, in Italy, in Greece, in Egypt, in North Africa, and in Spain. Over the course of several years, Caesar's military skill, combined with the loyalty of his veteran legions, gave him a series of crucial advantages. Pompey was decisively defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus, Greece, in 48 before Christ, and fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated shortly after his arrival, on the orders of the Egyptian court, who hoped, mistakenly, to curry favour with the victorious Caesar. By 45 before Christ, after several more years of campaigning against remaining Pompeian forces, Caesar had effectively won the civil war and become the unchallenged master of the entire Roman world. He was appointed dictator, eventually for life, an unprecedented break from the traditional limits on this emergency office. He undertook significant reforms, reorganizing the calendar into a form remarkably close to the one still used throughout much of the world today, extending citizenship to various provincial populations and planning ambitious public works projects. But many traditional Roman aristocrats, deeply attached to the old republican ideals of shared power and collective governance, viewed Caesar's accumulation of personal authority with growing alarm, fearing that he intended to make himself an outright king, a title that carried deep and ancient horror in Roman political culture, dating back to the legendary expulsion of Tarquin the Proud centuries before. A conspiracy formed among a group of senators, including men who had previously been Caesar's allies, and even close personal friends, most famously Marcus Junius Brutus, whose ancestor had supposedly led the original expulsion of the kings 500 years earlier, on the Ides of March, the 15th day of March, in 44 before Christ. The conspirators surrounded Caesar in the Senate house and stabbed him to death, reportedly inflicting 23 separate wounds. The conspirators believed they were restoring the Republic, removing a dangerous tyrant who threatened to extinguish centuries of shared governance. Instead, they unleashed nearly 2 decades of further civil war, conflict that would ultimately destroy the very republic they had hoped to save. Rest here for a moment. In this moment of blood and betrayal in the Senate House, the man is dead, but what he began cannot be undone. The old republic, with its checks and balances, its shared power among elected magistrates, is dying with him, even as his murderers believed they were saving it. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of this history settle around you. We are approaching one of the great transformations in human governance, the birth of something genuinely new. The story continues. In the chaotic aftermath of Caesar's assassination, several figures emerged to contest control of the Roman world. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, initially seemed positioned to inherit Caesar's political mantle, but a surprising rival emerged, Caesar's adopted heir, his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, a young man of only 18 at the time of Caesar's death, who would later be known to history as Octavian, and eventually, after even greater transformations, as Augustus. Octavian proved to be a political operator of extraordinary skill, far exceeding what his youth and relative inexperience might have suggested. He formed an alliance, the Second Triumvirate, this time formally established by law, with Mark Antony and another general named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Together, these three men hunted down and eliminated Caesar's assassins, most notably defeating Brutus and another leading conspirator, Cassius, at the Battle of Philippi in 42 before Christ. The second triumvirate, like the alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus before it, was inherently unstable, a temporary arrangement among ambitious men who fundamentally distrusted one another. Lepidus was gradually marginalized and eventually forced into political retirement. And the relationship between Octavian and Antony, the two remaining power brokers, deteriorated steadily over the course of the 30s before Christ, exacerbated by Antony's increasingly close political and personal alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, the last representative of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. The final confrontation between Octavian and Antony came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 before Christ, off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's forces, commanded by his skilled general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, won a decisive victory. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, the following year, with Octavian's forces closing in on Alexandria, both took their own lives rather than face capture and humiliation. With Antony's defeat and death, Octavian stood as the sole unchallenged master of the entire Roman world, just as Caesar had been less than 2 decades before. But Octavian had learned crucial lessons from his adoptive father's fate. He understood that openly seizing total power, in ways that too obviously violated traditional republican sensibilities, had led directly to Caesar's assassination. So Octavian pursued a far more careful, gradual, and politically sophisticated approach. In 27 before Christ, he formally returned extraordinary powers to the Senate and the Roman people. In a carefully staged political performance, the Senate, in turn, voted to grant him a series of titles and powers, while maintaining the careful fiction that Rome remained, technically, a republic. He received the title Augustus, meaning roughly the illustrious or revered one, a name carrying religious and quasi-divine connotations. Without explicitly claiming kingship or outright divinity, he held the powers of a tribune, allowing him to veto Senate actions and protect his own person from prosecution. Without holding the office itself, he held proconsular authority over the most important provinces, particularly those containing the bulk of Rome's military forces, ensuring his control over the legions while technically governing through appointed deputies rather than ruling directly as a king. This careful, deliberately ambiguous system, often called the Principate by modern historians, from princeps, meaning first citizen, one of the titles Augustus favoured, allowed him to wield what amounted to absolute power while maintaining the outward forms and vocabulary of the Old Republic. Most Romans, exhausted by decades of civil war and political violence, were, on the whole, deeply relieved to accept this arrangement, in exchange for the stability and peace it promised. And Augustus delivered on that promise remarkably well. His reign, lasting until his death in 14 after Christ, a remarkable 41 years, inaugurated what the Romans themselves would call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative internal stability and security that would last, with occasional interruptions, for roughly 2 centuries. Augustus undertook massive building projects across Rome and the provinces, reorganized the army into a smaller, more professional, more sustainable force, reformed the tax collection system to reduce corruption and abuse, and established a more orderly system of provincial administration. He famously boasted, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, that he had found Rome built of brick and left it built of marble. A claim that, while perhaps somewhat exaggerated, captures something genuine about the transformative scale of his building programs. Let us rest here. In this moment of transformation completed, the Republic, in any meaningful sense, is gone. Even though its forms and vocabulary persist, in its place stands something new, an empire ruled, in practice, if not always in explicit law, by a single individual, though one who has learned, carefully and deliberately, to disguise that reality behind familiar republican language and institutions. Breathe slowly. Feel the peace that settles over the Roman world after so many decades of violence. The Pax Romana has begun, and for the first time in generations, the Roman world can simply rest. The 2 centuries following the establishment of the Augustan Principate, roughly from the birth of Christ to the late 2nd century after Christ, represent in many ways the height of Roman civilization. The period when Roman power, prosperity, and cultural achievement reached their fullest extent. This is sometimes called the Pax Romana, though it was never a period entirely without conflict, particularly along the frontiers, where Roman legions continued to fight various wars of expansion or dents against external peoples. But within the core territories of the empire, across most of the Mediterranean world and much of Western and Central Europe, this period saw an extraordinary degree of internal stability, economic integration, and cultural flourishing. The emperors who followed Augustus, sometimes called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, since they were connected by blood or adoption to either the Julian or Claudian branches of the old Roman aristocracy, included some remarkable and sometimes deeply troubling figures. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and successor, was a capable administrator but became increasingly reclusive and, according to many ancient sources, increasingly paranoid and cruel in his later years, eventually withdrawing from Rome entirely to rule from the island of Capri. Caligula, who followed Tiberius, is remembered by ancient historians as a figure of extraordinary cruelty and erratic, even deranged behavior, though modern historians note that our surviving sources, written largely by the senatorial aristocracy that Caligula had treated with particular contempt, may have exaggerated or distorted his actual conduct to some degree. He was assassinated by officers of his own Praetorian Guard in 41 after Christ. Claudius, who followed, proved a more capable and effective administrator than many had expected, given his physical disabilities and the low expectations many contemporaries had held for him, overseeing significant expansion of the empire, including the conquest of Britain, beginning in 43 after Christ. And Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, ruling from 54 to 68 after Christ, became, in later Roman and especially early Christian tradition, perhaps the single most notorious villain among all Roman emperors, remembered for the great fire that devastated much of Rome in 64 after Christ, for his persecution of the early Christian community, who were blamed fairly or not for that fire, and for a final descent into what many contemporaries viewed as genuine madness. Fleeing Rome and taking his own life in 68 after Christ as rebellion spread against his rule, after a brief, chaotic period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, stability returned under Vespasian, who founded the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, oversaw significant building projects, most famously beginning construction of the great amphitheatre we know today as the Colosseum, formerly called the Flavian Amphitheatre, completed under Titus in 80 after Christ. This extraordinary structure, capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators for gladiatorial combats, staged hunts of exotic animals brought from across the empire, and even, according to some sources, elaborate staged naval battles flooded into the arena floor, remains one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Rome to this day, nearly 2,000 years after its construction. The period from 96 to 180 after Christ, encompassing the reigns of 5 successive emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, is often called the era of the 5 good emperors, a period that the later Roman historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, famously described as perhaps the happiest and most prosperous period in the entire history of the human race, whether or not we accept such a sweeping judgment. This period certainly represents Roman civilization near its absolute zenith. Trajan, ruling from 98 to 117, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia, roughly modern Romania, and pushing briefly into Mesopotamia in the east. His column in Rome, covered in extraordinarily detailed relief carvings depicting his Dacian campaigns, remains one of the great masterworks of Roman sculptural art. Hadrian, who followed, took a different approach, generally favouring consolidation over further expansion, famously building Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain to mark and defend the empire's frontier, and undertaking extensive travels throughout the provinces, personally inspecting and improving the administration of his vast territories. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, ruling from 161 to 180, is remembered not only as an emperor but as a philosopher. His personal reflections, written largely while on military campaign and known to us as the Meditations, remain one of the most enduring works of Stoic philosophy, offering a remarkably intimate window into the inner moral and spiritual struggles of a man who held more worldly power than almost anyone else alive in his era, yet who clearly grappled deeply and with genuine humility with questions of duty, mortality, and how to live a good and virtuous life. Let us rest here, in this height of Roman power and achievement. The empire stretches from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria, from the forests of Germany to the sands of North Africa. Trade flows freely across this vast territory, protected by Roman law and Roman roads. Cities flourish, theatres and baths and temples rising in even relatively remote provincial towns, built according to recognizably Roman architectural patterns, yet often incorporating distinctly local elements as well. This is Rome at its fullest flowering. Breathe slowly, and let the warmth and prosperity of this golden age settle around you, like sunlight on a Mediterranean afternoon. But even golden ages, however magnificent, do not last forever. And the story of Rome's later centuries would prove to be a very different and ultimately far more difficult chapter. Before we move forward into the difficulties of Rome's later centuries, let us pause here, in the comfortable warmth of this golden age, and explore something equally important to understanding ancient Rome. Not the emperors and the battles and the political maneuvering, but the texture of everyday Roman life. What did an ordinary Roman actually experience in their daily existence across these centuries of empire? A typical Roman day began early, often before dawn, particularly for those of more modest means who needed to begin their work as soon as there was sufficient light to see by. Wealthy Romans typically began their day with the salutatio, a formal morning reception during which clients, individuals bound to a wealthy patron through ties of mutual obligation, would visit their patron's home to pay respects, seek favors, or simply demonstrate their loyalty and connection. This patron-client relationship was fundamental to Roman social organization, creating webs of mutual obligation that bound together individuals of different social ranks throughout Roman society. Breakfast, for those who ate one at all, was typically a simple affair: bread, perhaps with cheese or fruit, eaten quickly before the day's activities began in earnest. The main meal of the day, for many Romans, came in the early afternoon, called the cena, though for wealthier households this could become an elaborate, multi-course affair, extending well into the evening, particularly when hosting guests. A formal Roman dinner party, a convivium, typically involved guests reclining on couches arranged around a central table, in a room called the triclinium, named for the traditional arrangement of 3 couches. Romans generally ate with their hands, using spoons primarily for liquid dishes, and used small knives for cutting, though forks as we know them today were not part of standard Roman dining practice. Roman cuisine drew on a wide variety of ingredients. Bread and grains formed the staple foundation of most diets, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, olive oil, and, for those who could afford it, meat and fish. A distinctive and ubiquitous Roman condiment was garum, a fermented fish sauce that the Romans used much as modern cooks might use salt or soy sauce, adding it to an enormous variety of dishes for its distinctive savoury, salty flavour. Wine was the standard beverage at all social levels, though typically diluted with water, sometimes quite heavily. Drinking wine completely undiluted was generally viewed as a sign of poor breeding or excessive indulgence. The public baths, the thermae, represented one of the most distinctively Roman social institutions, found in virtually every city and town throughout the empire. Regardless of size or wealth, these were not merely places to wash, though that was certainly one function, but genuine social centres, where Romans of various social ranks, men and women typically bathing at different times or in separate facilities, would gather to socialise, conduct business, exercise, and relax. A typical bathing sequence might progress through rooms of varying temperature: the tepidarium, a warm room for initial relaxation; the caldarium, a genuinely hot room, often including a hot plunge pool; and finally the frigidarium, a cold room with a cold plunge pool intended to close the pores and invigorate the bather after the heat of the previous rooms. Larger bath complexes, particularly in Rome itself, could include libraries, exercise grounds, gardens, and even small theatres, making them genuine multi-purpose civic centres rather than merely functional washing facilities. Roman clothing followed recognizable patterns across the social spectrum, though with significant variations in quality of material and elaborateness of style depending on wealth and status. The toga, that distinctive draped garment we most associate with ancient Rome, was actually reserved specifically for male Roman citizens, and was generally reserved for formal occasions rather than everyday wear, being a famously cumbersome and impractical garment for ordinary daily activities. For everyday wear, both men and women typically wore a simpler garment called a tunic, essentially a straightforward sewn garment, varying in length, material, and decoration according to wealth, status, and occasion. Women's clothing might also include a stola, a longer, more formal outer garment, and a palla, a kind of shawl or wrap that could be draped over the shoulders or even over the head. Roman housing varied enormously according to wealth. The wealthy lived in domus, private houses typically organized around one or more central courtyards, often elaborately decorated with wall paintings, mosaic floors, and, for the truly wealthy, private gardens and even small fountains. The vast majority of urban Romans, however, particularly in a crowded city like Rome itself, lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings, often several stories tall, with shops or workshops typically occupying the ground floor, and increasingly cramped, increasingly modest living quarters on the upper floors, the very highest floors, often poorly constructed and at constant risk of fire or structural collapse, were typically the most crowded and least desirable, occupied by the poorest urban residents. Fire, in fact, was a constant and serious danger in densely built Roman cities, with their reliance on oil lamps and wood construction in many buildings, and devastating fires, like the Great Fire of Rome in 64 after Christ, were unfortunately not uncommon occurrences throughout Roman urban history. Let us rest here for a moment, in this texture of ordinary Roman life. The morning visit to a patron's house, the midday meal, simple or elaborate depending on one's means, the relaxing warmth of the public baths in the afternoon, the careful arrangement of a toga for some formal occasion, or the simpler comfort of an everyday tunic. These were the rhythms that structured the daily existence of millions of ordinary people across the vast extent of the Roman world. For century after century, breathe slowly and let yourself imagine, just for a moment, living within these rhythms yourself. The warm stone beneath bare feet in a bath complex, The taste of bread and olive oil at a simple breakfast, the murmur of Latin conversation in a crowded marketplace. These small human details are what made up the actual lived experience of this vast and ancient civilization. Beneath all the grand history of emperors and conquests we have been exploring, now let us return to that grander history and continue our journey forward in time. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 after Christ and the succession of his son Commodus is often identified by historians as a significant turning point. The moment when the long stability of the Pax Romana began to give way to increasing instability and crisis. Commodus proved to be a deeply troubled and erratic ruler, more interested, according to many ancient accounts, in performing as a gladiator in the arena than in the actual responsibilities of governing the empire. He was assassinated in 192 after Christ, plunging Rome once again into a period of civil war and competing claimants to the imperial throne. Septimius Severus eventually emerged victorious from this conflict, establishing the Severan dynasty, which ruled with reasonable stability through the early 3rd century, though increasingly relying on the explicit support and favour of the military to maintain power, a dynamic that would become increasingly central and increasingly dangerous in the decades that followed. The middle decades of the 3rd century after Christ, roughly from 235 to 284, are often called the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of extraordinary internal instability, during which the Roman Empire came remarkably close to complete collapse and disintegration. This period saw an almost bewildering succession of emperors, many ruling for only months or a few years before being assassinated or killed in battle, typically by their own troops or by rival claimants supported by different military factions. Historians sometimes count more than 20 different individuals claiming imperial authority, in whole or in part, during this roughly 50-year period, a staggering degree of political instability compared to the relative stability of the preceding 2 centuries. Compounding this internal political chaos, the empire faced serious external military pressures on multiple frontiers simultaneously. In the east, a newly resurgent Persian empire under the Sassanid dynasty posed a serious military threat, even managing, in 260 after Christ, to capture a Roman emperor, Valerian, in battle, an unprecedented humiliation. Along the northern frontiers, various Germanic peoples, the Goths, the Alemanni, the Franks, and others, increasingly pressed against Roman defences, sometimes breaking through to raid deep into Roman territory. The empire briefly fractured into separate, competing political entities, a breakaway Gallic empire in the west, and a breakaway Palmyrene empire in the east, centered on the wealthy desert city of Palmyra under the remarkable warrior Queen Zenobia, before being gradually reunified through the military efforts of a series of capable soldier emperors, particularly Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275 and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, for his success in reuniting the fractured empire. The crisis was finally brought to a definitive close under the emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 after Christ and undertook sweeping, fundamental reforms to the structure of Roman government and administration, recognizing that the empire had simply become too vast and too vulnerable for effective management by a single ruler. Diocletian established a system known as the Tetrarchy, dividing administrative and military authority among 4 co-rulers, 2 senior emperors holding the title Augustus, and 2 junior emperors holding the title Caesar, each responsible for defending and administering a specific portion of the empire. This system, while it would not ultimately prove permanently stable in its original form, succeeded in restoring effective governance and frontier defense for the immediate crisis, and established a template of dividing administrative responsibility across multiple rulers that would, in various modified forms, persist for much of the remainder of Roman imperial history. Diocletian also undertook significant economic and administrative reforms, attempting to address rampant inflation through price controls, reorganizing the tax system, and reforming provincial administration into smaller, more manageable units. After ruling for 2 decades, Diocletian did something almost unprecedented among Roman emperors. He voluntarily retired from power in 305 after Christ, reportedly spending his remaining years cultivating vegetables on his estate, a remarkably peaceful conclusion to a reign that had begun amid such crisis and chaos. But the system of shared imperial power that Diocletian had carefully constructed did not survive his retirement intact, and a new round of civil wars erupted among various claimants and their supporters. From this renewed conflict emerged one of the most consequential figures in all of later Roman history, and indeed in the broader history of Western civilization, Constantine. Let us rest here for a moment. In this period of crisis survived and renewal beginning, the empire has faced its near collapse and has been pulled back from the brink through extraordinary administrative reforms and military effort. But the world is about to change again, in ways that would prove even more profound and lasting than the political reforms of Diocletian. Breathe slowly, and let this turning point settle gently around you, as we move toward one of the most significant transformations in the entire history of Rome. Constantine's path to power began with his being acclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain in 306 after Christ, following the death of his father, who had held one of the senior positions in Diocletian's tetrarchic system. What followed was nearly 2 decades of complex political maneuvering and periodic warfare among various rivals for imperial authority, as the carefully balanced system of shared power that Diocletian had constructed gradually collapsed into renewed competition for sole rulership. The decisive moment in Constantine's rise came at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, in 312 after Christ, where Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius in a battle that secured his control over the western portion of the empire. According to later Christian tradition, Constantine experienced a vision or sign before this battle, instructing him to place a Christian symbol on his soldiers' shields and attributing his subsequent victory to the favor of the Christian God. Whatever the precise historical reality behind this account, which comes to us primarily from later Christian sources, with obvious motivations to present Constantine's conversion in the most favorable possible light, Constantine's reign marked an unmistakable and historically transformative turning point in the relationship between the Roman state and Christianity. For nearly 3 centuries, Christianity had existed as, at best, a tolerated minority religion within the Roman world, and at various points had faced serious, sometimes brutal, official persecution, including significant persecutions under emperors like Nero, Decius, and most severely, Diocletian himself. Shortly before Constantine's rise to power, Constantine reversed this pattern decisively in 313 after Christ, together with his eastern co-emperor Licinius. He issued what is commonly known as the Edict of Milan, establishing official toleration for Christianity throughout the Roman world, and providing for the restoration of property previously confiscated from Christian communities during periods of persecution. Constantine's own personal religious beliefs and practices remain a subject of considerable historical debate. He was not baptized as a Christian until shortly before his death, and continued, throughout much of his reign, to maintain various traditional pagan religious practices and symbols, alongside his evident favor toward Christianity. But his political and material support for the Christian Church was unmistakable and historically decisive. He funded the construction of major Christian churches, not including significant building projects in Rome itself and in the Holy Land, granted the Christian clergy various legal privileges and exemptions previously reserved for traditional pagan priesthoods. And in 325, after Christ convened and personally presided over the Council of Nicaea, a gathering of Christian bishops from across the empire that addressed significant theological disputes within the early church, particularly regarding the precise nature of Christ's divinity. And that produced the original form of what remains, in modified form, one of the most important statements of Christian doctrine, the Nicene Creed. Constantine also undertook another transformation of profound and lasting significance. In 330 after Christ, he formally dedicated a new imperial capital, built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosphorus Strait, controlling access between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. This new city, which Constantine modestly named after himself, Constantinople, would serve, in various capacities, as a major or primary imperial capital for the remainder of Roman, and subsequently Byzantine, imperial history, for well over 1,000 years to come, until its eventual capture by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The establishment of Constantinople reflected a broader, increasingly significant shift in the practical center of gravity within the Roman world, away from Italy and the Western Mediterranean toward the wealthier, more populous, and increasingly more strategically significant eastern provinces. Following Constantine's death in 337 after Christ, the empire experienced renewed periods of both unified and divided rule among his successors and their various rivals. But the broader trajectory that Constantine had established toward an increasingly Christian religious identity for the Roman state, and toward an increasingly important Eastern, Greek-speaking half of the empire, would only intensify in the decades and centuries that followed. Let us rest here. In this profound moment of transformation, the old gods of Rome, Jupiter and Mars and Venus, who had watched over the city since its legendary founding, are gradually giving way to a new religious order. A new capital rises in the east, destined to outlast Rome itself by 1,000 years. The world that Romulus and Remus supposedly founded on 7 hills is becoming something genuinely new, even as it continues, in form and law and language, to call itself by the same ancient name. Breathe slowly, and let this transformation settle gently around you, like incense smoke rising in a new Christian basilica, mingling, just for this moment in history, with the older smoke of traditional Roman religious sacrifice. The story moves forward into the final chapters of Western Roman history. The decades following Constantine's death saw the Roman Empire increasingly divided, both formally and informally, between Western and Eastern halves, each typically governed by separate emperors, though theoretically still constituting a single unified empire under Roman law and tradition. This division reflected genuine practical realities. The eastern provinces were generally wealthier, more urbanized, and more easily defensible, while the western provinces faced increasingly serious military pressure along their northern frontiers from various Germanic peoples whose own movements were, in turn, often driven by pressure from other peoples further east, most significantly the Huns, a nomadic confederation whose westward expansion in the 4th century set in motion a complex chain of population movements that historians often call, collectively, the migration period, or sometimes, somewhat more dramatically, the barbarian invasions. A pivotal moment in this unfolding crisis came in 376 after Christ, when a large population of Gothic peoples, themselves fleeing pressure from the advancing Huns, requested permission to cross the Danube River frontier and settle within Roman territory under Roman protection. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens granted this request, but subsequent mismanagement and exploitation of these Gothic refugees by local Roman officials led to open rebellion. At the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 after Christ, Gothic forces inflicted a devastating defeat on the Roman army, killing Valens himself in the fighting. One of the most significant Roman military disasters in centuries, and a stark demonstration that the military balance of power along Rome's frontiers was shifting in increasingly dangerous directions. The following decades saw continued, complex, and often unstable relationships between the Roman state and various Gothic and other Germanic groups, sometimes fighting against Rome, sometimes serving as Roman military allies, sometimes settling, with varying degrees of formal Roman permission. Within Roman territory itself, the Visigothic king Alaric, after a long and complicated series of negotiations and conflicts with the Western Roman court, eventually led his forces to besiege and ultimately capture the city of Rome itself in 410 after Christ, an event that sent profound psychological shockwaves throughout the Roman world. The city of Rome itself, the ancient and symbolic heart of the entire civilization, had not been successfully captured by a foreign enemy since the Gallic sack nearly 800 years earlier. While the practical damage from this sack was reportedly relatively limited, compared to what might have been feared, and Rome itself had in any case ceased to function as the actual administrative capital of the Western Empire some time before this event, the symbolic impact was nonetheless immense, prompting the Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo to write his monumental work, The City of God, partly in direct response to pagan critics who argued that Rome's misfortunes demonstrated the failure of the empire's new Christian religious orientation to protect its traditional pagan-era greatness and security. The following decades brought continued pressure and territorial losses for the Western Roman Empire. Various Germanic kingdoms, the Vandals in North Africa, the Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, the Burgundians and eventually the Franks in other regions of Gaul, established increasingly independent and permanent political control over what had previously been core Roman territories, often maintaining nominal recognition of continued Roman imperial authority, while exercising what amounted, in practical terms, to genuine sovereign rule. The mid-5th century brought another significant crisis, in the form of the Huns themselves, under their formidable leader Attila, who launched devastating campaigns into both the eastern and western portions of the Roman world. In 451 after Christ, a combined Roman and Visigothic army, under the capable Roman general Flavius Aetius, managed to check Attila's advance into Gaul at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Though Attila's subsequent invasion of Italy itself the following year was halted, according to later Christian tradition, by the personal diplomatic intervention of Pope Leo I, who reportedly persuaded Attila to withdraw rather than march on Rome itself. Attila's death in 453 after Christ led to the relatively rapid collapse of the Hunnic Confederation, but the Western Roman Empire itself had been profoundly weakened by decades of military crisis, territorial loss, and the related collapse of its traditional tax base and administrative capacity. The final decades of the Western Empire saw a series of increasingly powerless emperors, often controlled or installed by powerful Germanic military commanders who had come to dominate what remained of the Western Roman military establishment. The traditional date historians use to mark the formal end of the Western Roman Empire is 476 after Christ, when the Germanic military commander Odoacer deposed the young Western emperor, with the almost poignantly ironic name Romulus Augustulus, echoing both the legendary founder of Rome and its first emperor, and declined to appoint any successor, instead sending the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, with a message acknowledging that a single emperor was now sufficient to govern what remained of Roman authority. It is worth noting, as many historians today emphasize, that this moment likely felt far less dramatically conclusive to people actually living through it than it does to us, looking back with the benefit of historical hindsight. Roman administrative structures, Roman law, Roman cultural and religious institutions did not simply vanish overnight in 476, but persisted in gradually transforming and adapting forms for generations and even centuries afterward, throughout much of what had been the Western Roman world. And in the East, the Roman Empire, centered now on Constantinople, continued to exist, continued to call itself Roman, in its own Greek language Romania, for nearly another 1,000 years, until the final fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 after Christ, a continuity of Roman political identity stretching back, in an unbroken, if dramatically transformed line, all the way to those legendary origins on 7 hills above the Tiber River, more than 2,000 years earlier. Let us rest here, in this long, slow ending of one chapter of Roman history. The Western Empire, weakened by centuries of internal and external pressure, finally relinquishes even the formal pretense of independent imperial rule. But Rome, as an idea, as a civilization, as a continuing political and cultural tradition, does not simply disappear. It transforms, adapts, and, in its Eastern incarnation, continues for another 1,000 years. Breathe slowly, and let this long, gradual transformation settle gently around you, like dust slowly settling over an ancient road, worn by the footsteps of legions who marched it for centuries, but never to be entirely erased. Before we conclude our long journey through Roman history, let us pause, here in the quiet darkness, to consider some of the most enduring and remarkable achievements of Roman civilization, the things that did not simply vanish with the political transformations we have just explored, but that continue, in various forms, to shape our world even today. Roman law represents perhaps one of the most profound and lasting Roman achievements. Over the course of many centuries, Roman jurists developed an extraordinarily sophisticated body of legal principles and procedures, covering virtually every aspect of civil and criminal law, property rights, contracts, family relationships, and the basic legal status and protections of citizens. This legal tradition was eventually codified in its most comprehensive and influential form under the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian in the 6th century after Christ, in a massive compilation known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This Justinianic legal code, rediscovered and studied with renewed intensity by medieval European scholars, beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries, became one of the foundational sources for the legal systems of most of continental Europe, and through European colonial expansion, for legal systems across much of the rest of the world as well. Many basic legal concepts that we take for granted today, the presumption of innocence in criminal proceedings, the basic structure of contract law, fundamental principles regarding property rights and inheritance, trace their origins, directly or indirectly, back to Roman legal thought. Roman engineering and architecture similarly left an indelible mark on the world. The extensive network of Roman roads, eventually stretching for tens of thousands of miles across the empire, connecting even relatively remote provincial regions to the broader imperial transportation and communication network, represented an engineering achievement of extraordinary scale and sophistication, built with multiple layers of carefully prepared foundation material, and surfaced, in their most developed form, with closely fitted paving stones. Many sections of these ancient roads survive, remarkably, to this day, sometimes still in active use, nearly 2,000 years after their original construction. Roman aqueducts, similarly, represented extraordinary feats of hydraulic engineering, carrying fresh water, sometimes across distances of many miles, using precisely calculated gradients to maintain consistent water flow purely through gravity, without any mechanical pumping into Roman cities and towns, supplying public fountains, baths, and, for wealthier households, even private indoor plumbing. The development and widespread use of concrete, a Roman innovation combining volcanic ash, lime, and water into an extraordinarily durable building material enabled architectural achievements that would not be matched in scale or structural sophistication for many centuries after Rome's decline. The Dome of the Pantheon in Rome, constructed of unreinforced concrete, remains even today the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the entire world, a testament to the sophistication of Roman engineering knowledge. The Latin language itself, the everyday spoken tongue of the Roman people, gradually evolved in the centuries following the political fragmentation of the Western Empire into the various Romance languages spoken across much of Europe today: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and others, each representing a distinct, gradually diverged descendant of the spoken Latin that Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators carried with them across their vast territories. And Latin itself, in its more formal written form, continued to serve for many centuries after Rome's political decline as the primary language of scholarship, religion, law, and diplomacy across much of Western Europe, a remarkable testament to the enduring cultural prestige and practical utility of the Roman linguistic legacy. Roman literature and rhetoric similarly exercised enormous influence on subsequent Western intellectual and educational traditions. The orations of Cicero, the historical writings of Tacitus and Livy, the poetry of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, the philosophical reflections of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, these and many other Roman authors continued to be studied, copied, and emulated by scholars and writers throughout the medieval and early modern periods, and indeed continue to be read and studied today, more than 2,000 years after they were originally composed. Roman political concepts and vocabulary similarly continued to shape political thought and practice for many centuries. The very word republic derives directly from the Roman res publica. The structure of the United States government, with its careful division of powers, its system of checks and balances, its Senate, explicitly named after and modelled on the Roman institution, was deliberately and explicitly designed by its 18th century founders with direct reference to Roman republican precedents and ideals, which they had studied closely in their classical educations. Let us rest here, in this final reflection on Roman legacy and influence, the roads we have walked through tonight. In our imagination, the legal principles, the engineering marvels, the literature, the very languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people today, all carry, in ways both obvious and subtle, the lasting imprint of this extraordinary civilization that began, according to its own treasured legend, with 2 infants and a wolf beside a muddy river, more than 2,700 years ago. Breathe slowly now, and let this vast sweep of history settle gently around you, like the warm Mediterranean evening settling over the 7 hills of Rome itself. As we draw this long journey to its close, let us return, one final time, to that river and those 7 hills. Where our story began so many hours ago, the Tiber still flows today, through the modern city of Rome, past ancient ruins and modern apartment buildings alike, carrying the same water in its eternal cycle that once reflected the torchlight of Republican senators walking home from late-night debates, that once carried Egyptian grain ships up to feed the hungry population of an imperial capital of 1 million people, that once perhaps carried away the ashes of a city burned during Nero's catastrophic fire. The 7 hills still rise above the modern city, their ancient names, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal, still marking the landscape, even as the buildings upon them have been built, destroyed, and rebuilt across more than 25 centuries of continuous human habitation. We have travelled together through an extraordinary span of human history tonight, from shepherds' huts on muddy hillsides, through the slow, patient construction of republican institutions, through wars against Carthage and the dramatic rise and fall of Julius Caesar, through the golden centuries of imperial peace and prosperity under Augustus and his successors, through crisis and renewal under Diocletian, through the profound religious transformation under Constantine, and finally through the long, gradual transformation of the Western Empire into the various successor kingdoms of medieval Europe. It is a story of extraordinary achievement, remarkable engineering and legal innovation, beautiful literature and philosophy that continues to shape our world today in countless ways we often barely even notice. So thoroughly has it been woven into the fabric of subsequent civilization. It is also, inevitably, a story containing extraordinary violence, conquest, slavery, and suffering. The honest history of any civilization that endured for so long, and that expanded its control across so vast a portion of the ancient world, cannot avoid these darker dimensions. And we do justice neither to history nor to the millions of ordinary people who lived through these events by pretending otherwise. But perhaps what is most remarkable, as we reach the end of this long telling, is simply the sheer scope and duration of the story itself. More than 1,000 years, by even the most conservative reckoning, from the traditional founding date to the formal end of the Western Empire, and nearly 2,000 years if we include the continuing Roman tradition in the East. Generation after generation, century after century, ordinary people, farmers and merchants and soldiers and senators and slaves and emperors, living out their lives with all the same fundamental human concerns, love and loss, ambition and fear, hope and disappointment, that animate human lives in any era, including our own. The same Tiber that flows past modern Rome tonight flowed past Romulus and Remus, according to legend, more than 27 centuries ago. The same stars that you might glimpse if you opened your eyes right now, looking up into whatever sky covers wherever you are resting tonight, are the very same stars that ancient Romans looked up at on countless nights across all those centuries, wondering perhaps about many of the same questions that occupy human minds today. Let yourself rest now in this long continuity of human experience, stretching back across so many centuries, connecting you in this quiet moment of rest and reflection to countless generations who came before, who built and dreamed and struggled and loved on those same 7 hills beside that same ancient river. The story of Rome, like all the great stories of human history, ultimately becomes part of a much larger story, the ongoing story of humanity itself, continuing to unfold, generation after generation, into whatever comes next. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body settle more deeply into whatever surface holds you. Here in this comfortable darkness, the river still flows, gentle and eternal, through the heart of an ancient and ever-changing world. The 7 hills still stand, patient witnesses to more than 25 centuries of human history. And you, resting here tonight, are simply the latest chapter in this vast, continuing human story. Sleep now. Let the weight of this long history settle gently into peaceful, restful sleep. The legions have completed their march. The senators have concluded their debates. The emperors have returned at last to dust. And the river flows on, patient and eternal, carrying everything gently forward into whatever comes next. Live well. Rest deeply. The story is complete for tonight. And the ancient world, having shared its long history with you, now gently releases you into peaceful, dreamless sleep. But before we let the story rest entirely, let us go back just once more into a part of Roman life we have not yet fully explored. Let us go into the arena, into the games, into one of the most distinctive, and to modern sensibilities, one of the most troubling aspects of Roman public culture. The gladiatorial games occupied an enormous place in Roman public life, far beyond what their modern equivalent, perhaps professional sports, might suggest. These spectacles began, according to Roman tradition, as part of funeral rites for important individuals, a kind of ritual combat intended to honor the dead, and gradually evolved into elaborate public entertainments. sponsored by wealthy individuals or by the state itself, as a means of displaying generosity, building political support, and providing entertainment for the urban masses. A typical day at the Games might include several distinct types of spectacle. The morning often featured venations, hunts, or combats involving wild and exotic animals brought from across the empire. Lions and leopards from North Africa, bears from Northern Europe, even on occasion, more exotic creatures like elephants or rhinoceroses, pitted against specially trained hunters called bestiari, or sometimes simply slaughtered in large numbers as a demonstration of Roman power over the natural world and its most distant exotic corners. The midday hours, in earlier periods of Roman history, sometimes featured public executions of criminals, often staged with deliberately theatrical or symbolic elements, sometimes drawing on mythological themes, and the afternoon, the period most associated in modern popular imagination with the Games, featured the gladiatorial combats themselves. Gladiators were typically, though not exclusively, drawn from among slaves. Criminals condemned to this fate, or prisoners of war, though a significant minority were free men who voluntarily took up this dangerous profession, sometimes drawn by the prospect of fame and financial reward. Despite the very real risk of death, gladiators trained in specialized schools, called ludi, under the direction of professional trainers, learning particular fighting styles associated with different categories of combatant, each typically equipped with distinctive weapons and armor. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, relying on mobility and reach. The secutor, often paired specifically against the retiarius, fought with a sword and a large shield, representing a heavily armored, more straightforward combat style. The Thraex carried curved swords and small shields, styled after Thracian warriors, contrary to popular modern imagination, shaped significantly by films and television. Gladiatorial combats were not always simply fights to the death. Significant training and expense went into producing skilled gladiators, and a fighter's death represented a real financial loss to whoever owned or sponsored him. Many contests concluded with one combatant clearly defeated but not killed. The decision of whether to spare a defeated gladiator's life often resting with the sponsor of the Games, sometimes influenced by the reaction and apparent wishes of the assembled crowd. Successful gladiators, those who survived multiple contests and developed reputations for skill and courage, could achieve a remarkable, if complicated, form of celebrity status. Graffiti surviving from Pompeii records gladiators being celebrated as objects of romantic admiration, Suspirium Puellarum, the sigh of girls, as one such inscription describes a particular fighter. Even as gladiators, as a social category, remained legally and socially marked by considerable stigma, generally excluded from many of the basic legal and social privileges enjoyed by ordinary citizens. The Colosseum itself, that great amphitheatre we explored briefly earlier in our journey tonight, represented an engineering and logistical achievement of remarkable sophistication, capable of holding, by most modern estimates, somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators, with an elaborate system of numbered entrances and seating sections organized according to social rank, ensuring that even in this place of shared public entertainment, the careful hierarchies of Roman society remained visibly and physically maintained. Beneath the arena floor itself, an extraordinary network of underground chambers and passages, known as the Hypogeum, housed animal cages, gladiator holding areas, and an elaborate system of lifts and trapdoors, allowing animals, scenery, and combatants to be raised dramatically into the arena at precisely calculated moments during the spectacle. Let us rest here for a moment in this complicated, sometimes troubling aspect of Roman culture. The Games tell us something important and uncomfortable about the values of this ancient civilization, its relationship with violence, its complicated mixture of cruelty and genuine appreciation for skill and courage. its use of public spectacle as a tool of social and political control. We need not approve of everything about ancient Rome to find its history fascinating and to recognize, honestly, both its genuine achievements and its genuine darkness. Breathe slowly, and let this complexity settle gently into your understanding of this ancient world. As we move toward the final moments of our long journey together tonight, let us also pause, briefly, to consider the Roman family and the lives of Roman women and children. Voices that survive less prominently in our ancient sources, dominated as those sources often are by the political and military affairs of men, but whose experiences nonetheless formed the essential foundational fabric of Roman society. The Roman family, the familia, was organized around the principle of patria potestas, the legal authority of the male head of household, the paterfamilias, over all members of his household, including his wife in earlier periods of Roman history, his children regardless of their age, and any enslaved persons within the household. This authority was, in its earliest and most extreme legal formulations, remarkably absolute, technically including, at least in legal theory, the power of life and death over his own children. In practice, by the periods of Roman history for which we have more extensive evidence, this extreme theoretical authority was tempered considerably by social custom, practical affection, and evolving legal restrictions. But the underlying structure of household authority remained a fundamental organizing principle of Roman family life throughout most of its history. Roman marriages were typically arranged, particularly among wealthier families, with practical considerations of family alliance, property, and social status often weighing more heavily than personal romantic preference. Though ancient sources do preserve numerous examples of apparently genuine affection and partnership between Roman spouses as well. Roman girls typically married at a younger age than was common in many other ancient societies, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, particularly among wealthier families eager to secure advantageous marriage alliances. Though the more typical age for a first marriage, particularly among less wealthy families, was probably somewhat later. In the mid to late teenage years, Roman women, despite lacking many of the formal political rights enjoyed by male citizens, the right to vote or hold public office, for instance, could nonetheless exercise considerable practical influence and authority, particularly within the domestic sphere, managing household finances and slaves, and in many documented cases, exercising significant informal political influence through their relationships with husbands, sons, or other male relatives in positions of public authority. Wealthy Roman women could also, under Roman law, own and control significant property in their own right, particularly as the legal restrictions of earlier periods gradually relaxed over the course of Roman history, and the surviving historical record preserves numerous examples of women conducting significant business affairs, commissioning public building projects, and exercising philanthropic patronage within their communities. Roman children, particularly in wealthier households, typically began their education at home, often under the direction of a Greek-speaking tutor, since bilingual education in both Latin and Greek was considered an essential mark of proper aristocratic upbringing throughout much of Roman history. Formal schooling, where available, particularly in larger towns and cities, typically progressed through several stages, beginning with basic literacy and arithmetic instruction from a teacher called a ludi magister, and for those continuing further, more advanced study of grammar, rhetoric, and literature, particularly the careful study and imitation of admired literary and oratorical models, considered essential preparation for any young man anticipating a future public career in law, politics, or administration. Roman childhood, like childhood in virtually every pre-modern society, was marked by significant mortality risk. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that perhaps a third or more of Roman children did not survive to adulthood, a sobering reality that shaped Roman attitudes toward childhood and family life in ways that can be difficult for modern readers, accustomed to vastly different mortality expectations, to fully appreciate. And yet, despite this harsh demographic reality, the surviving evidence, funerary inscriptions expressing genuine grief for lost children, personal letters describing parental affection and concern, makes clear that Roman parents, like parents in every era of human history, typically loved their children deeply and experienced their loss, when it occurred, as a source of profound personal grief. Let us rest here, in this glimpse of Roman family life, in the quiet, often unrecorded experiences of mothers and children, alongside the grander political and military history that dominates so much of our surviving evidence. These ordinary human experiences, love between parents and children, the careful management of households, the hopes parents held for their children's futures, connect us, perhaps more directly and intimately than any account of battles or political maneuvering, to the genuine humanity of these ancient people, separated from us by so many centuries, yet united with us by so many fundamentally shared human experiences. Breathe slowly, and let this quiet, intimate dimension of Roman history settle gently around you, as we approach, finally, the true conclusion of our long journey together tonight. Let us consider, finally, before we truly let this story rest, the texture of an ordinary evening in ancient Rome itself, in perhaps its golden age, the 2nd century after Christ, under the rule of one of the good emperors we discussed earlier in our journey tonight. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills beyond the Tiber, the rhythms of the great city would begin gradually to shift. The bustling commercial activity of the Forum, where merchants had spent the day conducting business beneath the shadow of ancient temples and government buildings, would slowly wind down, shopkeepers closing their stalls, porters making final deliveries before darkness made the narrow, winding streets genuinely dangerous to navigate. The public baths, having been open and busy throughout the afternoon hours, would see perhaps their final wave of visitors, those completing their business obligations in time for a relaxing soak before the evening meal, the warm water and steam providing welcome relief after a long day's labour or commerce. In wealthier households throughout the city, preparations for the evening meal, the cena, would be well underway, kitchen slaves working over open hearths, preparing dishes that might range from relatively simple fare, bread, cheese, vegetables, and perhaps some fish or modest cuts of meat, to far more elaborate preparations for households planning to entertain guests that evening, exotic imported delicacies, carefully prepared sauces, perhaps even, for the wealthiest and most ostentatious hosts, genuinely extravagant dishes intended primarily to demonstrate wealth and status rather than simple nutritional satisfaction. As actual darkness fell, oil lamps would be lit throughout the city, their flickering light providing the primary illumination for evening activities. Since Rome, of course, lacked any form of public street lighting in the way modern cities take for granted, meaning that anyone needing to travel through the city after dark typically required either a personal slave carrying a torch or lamp, or simply accepted the genuine risk of navigating dark, uneven, and potentially dangerous streets. The wealthy, gathered for their evening meal, would recline, according to traditional Roman dining custom, on couches arranged around a central table, in groups typically limited to a relatively intimate number of guests, allowing genuine conversation and social interaction throughout the often lengthy, multi-course meal. Conversation at such gatherings might range across an enormous variety of topics: current political affairs and gossip, philosophical and literary discussions. For those guests with appropriate education and inclination, business and financial matters, or simply lighter social conversation and entertainment, sometimes including hired musicians, dancers, or other performers, depending on the wealth and inclinations of the host. Meanwhile, in the far more numerous, far more modest households of ordinary Roman citizens, occupying the crowded apartment buildings, the insulae that housed the vast majority of the city's enormous population, evening meals would typically be simpler affairs, prepared and consumed quickly, often purchased ready-made from small shops or street vendors. Since many of the smaller apartments lacked adequate kitchen facilities for more elaborate home cooking, particularly given the very real fire risk associated with cooking fires in such densely packed, largely wooden buildings. As the evening progressed further, the city would gradually quiet, though Rome, even at its height, was never entirely silent. Even in the depths of night, the rumble of delivery carts, banned from the city's streets during daylight hours, specifically to reduce daytime traffic congestion, would echo through the streets. Merchants and suppliers, taking advantage of the nighttime hours to bring goods into the city's markets and shops, ready for the next day's commercial activity. In the distance, perhaps, the sound of the Tiber itself, flowing steadily past the city, carrying its eternal burden of water from the distant hills toward the sea, indifferent, in its ancient, patient way, to all the human drama and ambition and ordinary daily life unfolding along its banks. Above the city, on a clear night, the same stars that had watched over the legendary founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus, centuries before, would continue their own ancient, patient progression across the sky, indifferent witnesses to all the rise and triumph and eventual transformation of this remarkable human civilization. Let yourself rest now in this final quiet image of an ordinary Roman evening, the flickering oil lamps, the gentle murmur of conversation at a family dinner table, the distant sound of the eternal river, the same ancient stars overhead that have watched over this city, and indeed over all of human history. Across so many centuries, the story of Rome, this vast, complex, sometimes troubling, often inspiring civilization, has reached its conclusion for tonight. But the river continues to flow. The stars continue their patient progression. And somewhere, in the quiet darkness of your own rest tonight, the echoes of this ancient world settle gently, peacefully into sleep. Breathe slowly. Let your body rest completely now. The legions have returned home. The senators have concluded their final debates. The emperors, one after another, across so many centuries, have returned finally to dust. But you, resting here tonight, carry forward, in ways both obvious and subtle, the lasting legacy of this extraordinary ancient world. Sleep now. Rest deeply. Let the warm Mediterranean darkness, settling gently over 7 ancient hills, settle gently over you as well. The story is complete. And the ancient world, having shared its long, rich history with you tonight, now gently, peacefully, releases you into restful, dreamless sleep. Good night. There is one more aspect of Roman life we should explore tonight, before we let this long story finally come to rest. The Roman religious world, before Constantine's great transformation, was extraordinarily rich, complex, and woven into virtually every aspect of public and private life, in ways that can be difficult for modern readers, accustomed to clearer separations between religious and secular life, to fully appreciate. Roman religion was, at its core, deeply practical and transactional in character. The relationship between Romans and their gods was often understood through the concept of do des, I give so that you might give, a kind of careful, respectful negotiation between human beings and divine powers, conducted through proper ritual observance, appropriate sacrifice, and correct religious procedure. The Roman pantheon included an enormous number of deities, some inherited from very ancient Italian religious traditions, others absorbed and adapted from neighboring peoples, particularly the Etruscans, and, especially from the early Republic onward, increasingly identified with and modelled upon the gods of Greek religion and mythology. Jupiter, the great sky god, ruler of the heavens, occupied the position of chief deity within this divine hierarchy, worshipped in his great temple atop the Capitoline Hill, one of the most sacred sites in the entire city. Juno, his wife, served as protector of women and of the Roman state itself, while Minerva, often grouped with Jupiter and Juno in what was called the Capitoline Triad, presided over wisdom, strategic warfare, and craftsmanship. Mars, the god of war, held particular significance for the Romans, given their martial traditions and their legendary belief that Romulus himself was the son of this very god. Venus, goddess of love and beauty, gained particular prominence during the late Republic and early Empire, as Julius Caesar and his family claimed descent from her through her mortal son Aeneas, the legendary Trojan refugee whose journey to Italy, as recounted in Virgil's great epic poem the Aeneid, was understood to have laid the foundational groundwork for the eventual rise of Rome itself. Beyond these major Olympian-style deities, Roman religious life was filled with countless other divine powers, household gods called the Lares and Penates, who protected the home and family, and were honoured with small shrines and daily offerings within virtually every Roman household, regardless of wealth or social status, agricultural deities overseeing every aspect of farming and the harvest, and an enormous range of more specialised divine powers, overseeing everything from doorways to childbirth to the boundaries between properties. Roman religious practice centered heavily on proper ritual performance, sacrifice, prayer, and the careful observation of correct procedure, considered far more important in traditional Roman religious thought than questions of personal belief or inner spiritual conviction, which would become so much more central to the Christian religious tradition that eventually displaced traditional Roman religion. Public religious festivals punctuated the Roman calendar. Throughout the year, the Lupercalia in February, associated with fertility and purification, the Vestalia in June, honouring Vesta, goddess of the hearth, whose sacred perpetually burning flame was tended by the Vestal virgins, priestesses bound to decades of chastity and ritual service, and the Saturnalia in December, a particularly beloved festival marked by feasting, gift-giving, and a temporary, ritually sanctioned suspension of normal social hierarchies, during which, for instance, slaves were traditionally permitted certain liberties, and even, in some households, served by their own masters for the duration of the celebration. The College of Priests, the augurs, and various other religious officials oversaw the proper observance of religious ritual on behalf of the Roman state, including the practice of augury, the careful observation of natural signs, particularly the flight patterns of birds, believed to reveal divine favour or disfavour regarding proposed public actions, a practice that played a significant role in Roman political and military decision-making throughout much of Roman history. As Rome's empire expanded, Roman religious practice generally proved remarkably accommodating and syncretistic, readily absorbing and adapting local religious traditions encountered throughout the provinces, identifying local deities with familiar Roman equivalents, and generally requiring relatively little in terms of strict religious conformity from conquered or allied peoples. Beyond basic acknowledgement of Roman political authority and, in later periods, participation in the imperial cult, a relatively modest form of religious veneration directed toward the reigning emperor or his deified predecessors, understood more as an expression of political loyalty than as a demanding requirement of genuine religious devotion. This relatively tolerant, accommodating religious environment makes the periodic Roman persecution of early Christians somewhat distinctive and worth brief consideration. Christians faced official suspicion and periodic persecution, not primarily because of specific theological disagreements with traditional Roman religious belief, but because their refusal to participate in the imperial cult and their broader rejection of traditional Roman religious practice generally. was perceived by Roman authorities as a troubling form of political disloyalty, undermining the careful religious and social cohesion that traditional Roman religious practice was believed to help maintain throughout this vast, diverse empire. Let us rest here, in this rich, complex world of ancient Roman religious practice and belief, so different in many respects from later religious traditions, yet reflecting the same fundamentally human desire to understand and maintain right relationship with forces and powers larger than ordinary human existence, whether understood as Jupiter ruling from his temple on the Capitoline Hill, or in whatever form the sacred takes meaning within your own life and understanding tonight. Breathe slowly, and let this ancient religious world settle gently around you, alongside everything else we have explored together across this long, rich journey through Roman history. And now, truly, let us bring this long story to its rest. We began tonight beside a muddy river, with a legend of twin brothers and a wolf. We have travelled together through the careful construction of republican institutions, through devastating wars against Carthage, through the dramatic rise and fall of Julius Caesar, through the golden centuries of imperial peace under Augustus and his successors, through crisis and recovery, through profound religious transformation, and finally through the long, gradual ending of the Western Empire itself. We have explored not only the grand sweep of political and military history, but the quiet, intimate textures of ordinary Roman life, the warmth of the baths, the taste of bread and wine at a family table, the complicated spectacle of the arena, the love between parents and children, the careful, respectful negotiation between ordinary Romans and the many gods who watched over their daily existence. This has been a long journey, spanning more than 1,000 years of human history. And if you have stayed with this story all the way to its end, or perhaps, more likely, if sleep has already gently claimed you somewhere along the way, in either case, you have shared, for this brief time tonight, in the vast, rich, complicated story of one of humanity's most extraordinary civilizations. The Tiber River continues to flow, tonight, just as it has flowed for so many thousands of years, indifferent to empires rising and falling along its banks, patient and eternal in its ancient course toward the sea. The 7 hills continue to stand, bearing silent witness to more than 27 centuries of continuous human habitation and history. And somewhere, in the quiet darkness surrounding you right now, the echoes of this ancient world, the marching of legions, the debates of senators, the prayers offered to ancient gods, the laughter and grief of countless ordinary families across so many centuries, settle gently finally into peaceful and restful silence. Let your own breathing slow now, matching the patient, eternal rhythm of that ancient river. Let your body rest completely, here in this comfortable darkness. There is nothing more required of you tonight, no further history to absorb, no further story to follow. Simply rest, simply breathe, simply allow yourself to drift, gently and peacefully, into deep and restful sleep. The legions have completed their long march and returned home at last. The senators have concluded their final debates and gone to their rest. The emperors, one after another, across so many centuries, have returned, finally and peacefully, to dust, just as we all eventually shall. But the river continues to flow, patient and eternal, carrying everything gently forward, and you, resting here tonight, are simply the newest, most recent moment in this vast, continuing flow of human history and human experience. Sleep now, rest deeply and completely. The ancient world, having shared its long, rich story with you tonight, gently and peacefully releases you now into dreamless, restful sleep. Good night.